All right, welcome to Sundays with Stories. This is a weekly podcast brought to you by the Life Process Program, or LPP, or Online Addiction Coaching Program. I'm Zach Rhodes. I'm here with Dr. Stanton Peel, the creator of the Life Process Program. In each episode, we highlight and react to the past week's addiction-related news. As you'll notice, we don't always align with the way these news stories are portrayed. We'll tell you more on that soon. To learn more about the Life Process Program, visit lifeprocessprogram.com. And of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel or download this podcast on your preferred podcast app. Stanton, let's get into addiction in popular culture. Hulu's new series, Dopesick. Everyone loves it. Neither you or I can stand to watch it. No doubt it's entertaining, but the series paints a narrative about drugs that we don't align with. And I know you wanted to discuss the film and specifically some interviews that you listened to lately with the producer of the show. So let me turn it to you. What's on your radar?
Well, drug sick is a term that is so redolent with the, deepest, darkest days of drugs will take control of you and kill you. It's just shocking to see that title. And none of the reviews reflects on that. Drug sick. I mean, there's a whole movement to get beyond all of that. I mean, the Drug Policy Alliance, and of course, there's the spread of psychedelic drugs, and marijuana is essentially legalized in the United States. And Carl Hart, who's pretty prominent and gets out there a lot, says, who decided which drugs are okay and which are not okay? And so the answer has always been painkillers. It was heroin, but we've had a love-hate relationship with painkillers for 100 years and more. And so on the one hand, we're seeing more, we hear all the time about, psychedelic therapies, just psychedelic use in everyday life. And at the same time, we're pervaded with this sense that we're being towed under by painkillers. And of course, the latest data are post-pandemic. In 2020, 93,000 people died. But one of the things that people can't seem to reflect on is how that number has been skyrocketing since 2000, when there might have been around 17,000 deaths annually, and now we're up to 93,000 deaths annually. Just a remarkable increase. At the same time, the painkiller prescriptions have gone down. And another aspect of this, just that I want to throw in here, is how treatment has increased radically. So the two-pronged approach, which everybody agrees on, except me and you, is cutting back painkiller pills. Well, there is a group of people that disagrees with cutting back painkillers. And ironically, or not ironically, that's pain doctors. Because they're people who, obviously there have been some miscreants who wholesale painkiller pills. But in general, doctors are trying to come to grips with people who have pain one way or another. They're involved when they rely on painkillers, and that tends not to be called addiction. And now they're being severely hampered in doing that. And so a lot of normal medical bodies are actually more radical in some regards than drug policy reform groups who have been emphasizing constantly declining painkiller prescription, which has happened. And drug deaths have gone up. And at the same time, of course, everybody in the harm reduction business says we need to get more people on buprenorphine and Suboxone. In 2021, the Department of Health Services released a study published by Mathematica, where I used to work, by the way, and where I was when Ethan met me. Overall results suggest increases in the delivery of substance use disorder treatment provided in private doctors' offices and specialty outpatient settings, and the delivery of medication-assisted treatment. there is now, of all the people who the National Survey on Drug Use and Health measured to be dependent on an opioid, 50% are now getting treated because of this vast effort to expand to individual practices, both specified for painkiller addiction and in doctors' offices. And all of the articles like this will always say, oh my God, only 50% of people are getting treated. Mm-hmm. That's a stunning amount of people. It's just hard to, you know, if we're going to go back 100 years ago, if you were a person who relied on heroin, your chances of going into treatment in the United States were zero. And even as recently, the NLA study, which was conducted in this century, found that about 10% of people who were ever alcohol dependent received anything like alcoholism treatment. It just, when you think about what does it take for a person who's has a disorder with a substance to kind of get around to being diagnosed and exposed to and willingly go into treatment, it's so many filters, and now we're up to half. You sort of start wondering, gosh, what percentage of America is going to be in substance use treatment? And at the same time, of course, the death rate keeps going up from drugs. And so we have this contradiction that nobody confronts, except for you and me, and which is painkiller prescriptions are going down, which is contraindicated by actual people requiring them. Of course, a person who's written about this is our good friend at Reason Magazine, Jacob Sullum. And at the same time, everybody bemoans the fact that we're not prescribing enough buprenorphine, but it's astounding how far it's spread.
So we're able to have the show called Dopesick about the idea that painkiller, you blame the drug. So painkillers are ruining our society. So we've taken measures to decrease pain prescriptions, and that has just really happened drastically and in short order. People are prescribing much, much less. And at the same time, to reconcile all of this, we've tried to get people into treatment. And you said the number is about 50% of people who say that they have substance use disorder for opioids are in some form of treatment.
And the treatment is nearly always going to involve what's now, it used to be called MAT, medicine-assisted treatment. It's now MOUD,
right,
medication for opioid use disorder. It's believed to be the actual treatment, right?
And on the backdrop of all of this, the two main pillars of what we said, if this theory is true, opioids are addicting all of us. Well, the two pillars that should be working, if we're correct about this, are that you stop prescribing so much and you increase treatment. Both of those things are happening. People are dying more than
nonetheless,
right,
and more rapidly increasing numbers. I have read, there is a guy in Australia, I forget his name. He works with children, drug problems. I'm going to have to steal his quote. So damn succinct. I could put it in the cover of my book. Don't ask about the drug, ask about the person.
Mm-hmm.
Because drugs are here to stay. So in this context, there's a balancing act happening. On the one hand, there's this expression of a greater acceptance of people's using drugs. And you interviewed Pat Denning, who's the premier exponent of harm reduction psychotherapy, which says, come to me and tell me what you're doing, and I will do my best to help you make your life better. Mm-hmm. There's Carl Hart, who says, well, who says that all these people using drugs like methamphetamines and street opioids, including heroin, who decided they have problems while everybody using psychedelics and marijuana are fine? And there is a beginning of a movement. I think it's the state of Rhode Island has given a basic approval for drug consumption sites where narcotics will be consumed on site. I think it was the Atlantic, actually. I was surprised to see a mass publication. I think it was actually Time saying, you know, people are considering, well, so many people are dying. Why don't we allow people to take drugs anyhow? Why don't we allow people to take them in a safe consumption site where it's supervised, where they can assess the purity of the drug, and if there are any negative reactions, they're medical personnel. So that's on the one side of life. And I imagine, you know, people we know like Will Godfrey, the editor-in-chief of Filter, and Ethan Nadelman, the former head of the Drug Policy Alliance and the current head of the Drug Policy Alliance, Frederic, are pushing and welcoming those things. But on top of this comes a giant bomb, which is Dopesick, which is massive. Everybody sees it. And it's Danny Strong is the producer of Dopesick.
Batman is the star, so who's not going to watch it?
So, and who's Danny Strong? You think he's a great public health specialist, perhaps?
Well, I've been watching some interviews that he's done, and I can't imagine that he is.
Strong is best known for his roles as Jonathan Levinson in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Doyle McMaster in Gilmore Girls. So he's a media personality, and everybody says, oh, isn't it great? So I see him, I watch MSNBC, the sort of progressive station, where there's no consciousness, zero consciousness. You'll never hear harm reduction. You'll never hear clean needles. You'll never hear safe consumption sites. And they were extremely sympathetic to Strong. They loved him. And of course, it fits into another cultural meme, which is giant right now, which is the drug Big Pharma. And let me just mention, Big Pharma is the institution that is most behind the widespread use of Suboxone and buprenorphine in various combinations. That's their big moneymaker now, is treatment for opioids. And so Danny Strong gets on and said, I thought, you know, I'm so behind the times, I thought they were going to start talking about fentanyl, but I'm behind the times or ahead of the times. Do you know what the drug they feature is? What the drug of concern is? I mean, it's a drug everybody knows.
But in Dopesick?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Oxycontin.
Which is, wasn't that a while ago?
Yeah, it seems like it was a while ago. It does seem like a repeat. This is really retro.
Yeah.
But because it's about Purdue, and you know that their settlement. People see that, oh, these guys got out of jail free somehow. So that's news of late. So that's what I think.
Everybody's against Purdue.
Yeah.
I mean, who wants them to make billions? And they went unpunished. And so when Danny Strong talks, forgive me, it's a word salad. So I'm watching him. It changes your brain chemistry. It damages your frontal lobes. So you'll turn on your back on everything you love, your life, your family. You'll end up under a bridge. And then he repeats it, literally change your brain chemistry. So this is a combination of people ending up under bridges is an old image. It's, from 19th and 18th century Europe, they started developing poor people. When urbanization occurred, people come to city and live. So that's an old image. But literally changes nothing grabs the modern mind like saying it changes your brain chemistry.
Right.
And then Joe Scarborough, I love Joe Scarborough. I had a friend who was involved with other drugs, but this was the worst, uncontrollable. I presume he's talking about OxyContin, because now that imagery is used for fentanyl more often. Strong. There was an entire con played on doctors. Studies published in leading journals saying this was less addictive than other opioids. So then I'm watching a clip. Again, these are my favorite people. I love Nicole Wallace. She's interviewing, they're showing clips. They show Michael Keaton playing an Appalachian doctor. And he's broken up and he says, I can't believe how many, in the film it says, so were you told that only 1% of people became addicted? And then he starts crying and saying, I can't believe how many became addicted, how many of my patients became addicted. And then the commentary is the Keaton character in the series is going to experience some of the things that I did, said Lloyd. Lloyd was a doctor who was a consultant. Guess what Lloyd's current job is? He says the miniseries is balls on accurate. Damn it, that's street language. Guess what Lloyd's current job is?
He consults people who spin narratives like these.
He's a chief marketing officer at Nashville-based Cedar Recovery. So
let's make it really clear when the idea is, these people said, and this is Danny Strong, that only 1% of people became addicted, or that there's oxycontins are less addictive than other drugs. What is your reaction to that?
There's two things going on there. We have a steady stream of, our favorite people, Maya Salovitz, Carl Hart has written about this, Johan has written about this. And the National Survey on Drug Use shows that of all the people, which is just a government survey of all the people who have ever, in the previous year, and painkillers were used most frequently around 2017, and they declined steadily, 2013, and they declined steadily after that. About 1% developed develop a substance use disorder, because
the 1% number wound up being pretty small.
1% is like a regular number, and even in medical context, when they do studies, Jacob reviewed these studies. Those studies are now vilified as being done by, funded by, perpetrated by the manufacturers. And they actually sort of got up themselves in front of congressional committees, and they said, well, the research shows only 1% develop any kind of a disorder, which is far less than alcohol. And the reason you might say that's true is because they don't prescribe your alcohol. You're kind of totally on your own. But if you're under a prescription regimen, somebody's thinking, well, what's the appropriate dosage? And of course, that's one of the many, but a main problem with forbidding doctors or limiting doctors' ability to prescribe medications is then what happens? And the answer is they often go to the street.
I'll take a stab at your second part of that mix, which is that his problem was that they said opioids are less addictive. Right. And so there is something about that, but it's just not exactly the persuasion that Danny Strong is going for. You're going to say, what's addictive? And so what does it mean that something's less addictive, more addictive? It's just, it is what it is.
Well, I'm going to say what Carl Hart is going out and saying. Well, who says any of these drugs are that addictive? Right. I mean, given that people are given that as a rule of thumb, it's the underclass that uses heroin. Given that that's a completely unregulated market, what Carl Hart will say is, 80 to 90% of people take it without problems. And then the question becomes, how do they even do that? Of course, Norman Zinberg studied that. People in general don't want to die. I can't even remember her name. There's somebody massively popular now on on what's that reality where they go on and they give a lecture? What's that called?
TED Talks.
TED Talks. People don't choose to be addicted, which is that's the whole underlying meme is, well, people take drugs and they don't want to take drugs and they don't choose to be addicted. And in real world, people are taking drugs for some purpose under the sun that makes sense to them and fits into their lives. They're human beings. That transition in thinking is colossal. It's impossible. And addiction as used is the opposite of the idea that people are taking narcotics and heroin for some reason. It fits into their lives in some way. And so Carl Hart's going out, and Carl Hart's popular and undeniable, you know, the first professor, African-American professor of science, a distinguished neuroscientist and an author of bestsellers. So people love Carl and they listen to him. And then they say, well, he's crazy. And he takes heroin and has a history of heroin use for convenience, for, you know, reducing anxiety before meetings, you know, the whole range of reasons that people use drugs. And, you know, people sort of, a typical interview is, I really respect and admire Carl Hart, but what he's saying can't possibly be true. So we're in a time now, it's sort of like, well, people comment on American government. They say it's unbelievable. We sort of have always had disagreement, but we sort of used to have some method for working it out. And now we have these warring factions. This is a new war on drugs, by the way. So we have a giant, everybody knows the war on drugs is bad. So people don't say, oh, I think we haven't needed a new war on drugs. But Dopesick is war on drugs. Mm-hmm. It's a propaganda thing that says that drugs are killing people in untold numbers. The numbers are increasing. That it's the drugs that are responsible, that it's the purveyor of drugs, which is in this case of the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies, that are causing it, just sort of like the way it used to be, mysterious street drug dealers. And both cases, they're kind of they're symbols. I mean, Purdue Drug Company is just a regular drug company. God, I don't want to, we'll get canceled if we say anything. I'm not going to defend them in any way, shape, or form. Take all their money, distribute it to people in the street who have any kind of problems. That's fine with me. But we always, when we demonize drugs, we have to demonize drugs, which is your description. If we blame it on drugs, then we have to blame it on drug suppliers. Those have to be the bad guys. Then there have to be the innocent purveyors who are sucked in. They're being sucked in by Carl Hart. I mean, and you and I, neither of us have the guts to watch Dopesick.
Dopesick. But you're right. Neither of us can stomach it.
And you interviewed the guy who did. I kept calling it Moonland or something like that, and you would correct me. It's Dreamland, which is the same.
I didn't actually interview him. He never did show up to the interview.
Oh, he didn't.
No.
And they both do the same. They both frontal lobes. They both do that bullshit. Like the fact that drugs affect people's body chemistry. And then, you know, my life's work is saying, I'll summarize my view in addiction as represented in my book, Visible Over Your Right Shoulder, A Scientific Life on the Edge. Addiction takes place with regards to a powerful experience that people rely on to satisfy basic human needs, but that has a deleterious negative effect on their lives. That experience can come from any powerful source, including food, love, sex, shopping, exercise. It is true that drugs And what makes it successful, what makes an experience successful for addictive purposes, is that you can get that experience directly and predictably. You're trying to counteract anxieties and difficulties in coping with the real world. Something that substitutes well for that is something that hits you hard and fast. Drugs can do that well. Snorting cocaine, injecting heroin into your bloodstream, smoking cigarettes so it goes directly through your lungs are great ways to get an immediate drug hit. You know, ironically, pills are not as good, but they'll do. And, you know, you can measure things in terms of how quickly they deliver a hit. Sex is a quick hit thing. Sex is more addictive, potentially, than any drug. It's the most quick hit thing into the, let's talk dirty, limbic system, you know?
Ugh. Sorry.
So that model pervades America. It is on the other side of a scale. It's always there. It's always ready to be surfaced. And Danny Strong is the latest person to do that. You know, he'll go, nobody is going to, you know, Johann Hari wrote a bestseller where he highlighted Harry Anslinger, the kind of man who invented drug addiction and the original massive drug scare of the last century. The man who made everything illegal, you know, heroin, cocaine, and while they were at it, we're going back to 1914, the Harrison Act, marijuana. Why not? They're drugs.
Yeah.
And now we've spent the better part of a century, and we're at a point of saying, well, let's not make them illegal. Or, you know, Oregon supposedly has decriminalized all drug use, although they still funnel you into treatment, which is one of the reasons treatment figures are so high. So we're still walking on eggs around drugs. They're still not a normalized part of our life. Carl Hart's the front edge of a movement to say drugs are drugs. Drugs are things, people are all using drugs. We're all using something like drugs or drugs. Man, you know, majority of Americans drink alcohol, and yet we still can't accept bringing them into normal society. And so the Drug Policy Alliance, you know, Cassandra Federic is leading, I think, a movement in that direction, respecting drug users' choices. Pat Denning is somebody who says, well, I run a therapy program where we help people to control and moderate and eliminate the bad parts of any drug use that they're doing. There's a very thin slice saying, well, you know, people take drugs. Let's provide safe places for them to do that. And weighing like a giant elephant on the other side of the scale is Dopesick, drugs, brain chemistry, drug companies. And it just, that shouting just overwhelms the other message. So America's at war with itself. And of course, everybody loves, you know, everybody loves Michael Keaton. I mean, who's more popular than Michael Keaton? I mean, he's maybe not the biggest box office, but he's a nice guy, he's sincere. He would never do anything wrong. So there's a movie called Out of the Past where Robert Mitchum goes the wrong way with Kirk Douglas's girlfriend, Jane Greer.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a cab driver who drives them around in Mexico. They all end up dead. So, you know, they're going in a bad direction. And at one point, Robert Mitchum, who's just very wry, says, I wonder if that cab driver realizes just what a bad guy he was. And of course, the cab driver is just a cab driver driving them around. So I don't want to get in trouble with anybody, but I wonder if Michael Keaton realizes it's possible. Everybody's lauding him. Just what a bad thing he's doing to society.
Well, let me say that Michael Keaton doesn't necessarily have a responsibility as an actor to to go against whatever the message is being portrayed by the role that was written for him. You can make an argument that he should know better. Joe Scarborough, is that his name? Morning Joe.
Joe Scarborough, the guy.
So when I just need to make a point. When Danny Strong says something like, well, you know, doctors were sold this bill, and it changes your frontal lobe. I mean, it actually changes. I mean, the real question, if you're a thinking person, is, well, what doesn't? But if you even don't want to go that direction, Carl Hart, I sent you an interview we did with Lex Friedman, the MIT guy that makes robots all day. And Lex Friedman, even though he was trying to give Carl a platform and trying to say, you know, your views are important, he still pushed back on Carl about something and said, well, of course, there are drugs that really do kind of take you in a lot more and really are much more addictive. Carl's response was, what evidence you got for that bullshit? And he said, none. He said, right, because there is none. And you don't have to be, Joe Scarborough wouldn't have to be that rude, but he could say something like, tell me more about what you mean, or who did you hear this from? That's a journalist's responsibility, especially given that Danny Strong, as you mentioned, he's not, I mean, he doesn't have credentials or a background or even really a research set of bonus.
Describes Myasolovis doesn't really have research, but Danny Strong doesn't even know anything. But the best way, of course, the way that I do it, you know, Carl throws out, well, there's research. That's true. What I would do if I was in that room is to say, oh, Joe, have you or your children ever taken a painkiller? He had a famous incident on television where he had to rush his older son. I guess he's in his 20s to, you know, a New York hospital. I don't know. I forget what the problem was. And then I'd say, well, to everybody in the room, you know, Willie Geist and Maya Brzezinski, you know, the whole crew, have you ever taken a painkiller? And of course, everybody has.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever taken, you know, OxyContin type painkiller?
Right.
And they all have. And then you could say, well, did you become addicted? You know, in my book, Jacob Sullivan says that's my stock in trade, to say, reflect people on their own experience. So nobody knows what the National Survey on Drug Use and Health says. Nobody even knows what Jacob Sullivan said in the cover story in Reason Magazine. But everybody knows about their own experience. And it should be as obvious as day and night that people take drugs all the time and don't become addicted. And in particular, they don't become addicted to painkillers. They know that. I mean, I heard Mika Brzezinski, one of her daughters developed a knee injury. And she said, so we're giving her painkillers, but I'm really, you know, I'm going to taper that off. I'm really keeping my eye on that. You know, fine. But she's not going to. So they're telling you that OxyContin grabs your brain lobes, frontal lobes. You're addicted. And she's sort of saying, well, I don't believe that. My daughter had a lot of pain. I took painkillers, but I, you know, was mindful about it, which is normal human being experience, which you're not going to have that on Dopesick. Well, a lot of people, they're not going to have a panel of people who take painkillers, which is normal people in pretty reasonable circumstances, and say, oh, did you become addicted? Which is what I do in every one of my infrequent workshops. How do you regulate it? What caused you to regulate it? What enabled you to regulate it? People say, well, I had other obligations, you know, whether I like the painkiller experience or not. I thought, you know, I really got to get back into my life.
You extrapolate from your own experience, and then you can wonder, why would someone else's experience be different than mine? Of course, you're saying you would ask the whole crew there, but Joe Scarborough is Joe Scarborough. So what does he do? I mean, he might say something like, you know, what gives? I've taken painkillers before. I didn't become addicted. What's so different about these people? You know, that's a journalist kind of a question that he could ask.
Or he might have said, well, he said, oh, I had a friend who was a musician who was on a lot of drugs.
Right.
And he didn't say OxyContin, but he said these were the worst. But he might have said, oh, my son had maybe it was an appendicitis, something emergency. They operate on you. And then he might have said, well, my son, who I care about, took painkillers because he was operated on. They were really essential. And then he just stopped taking them because the prescription ran out. In fact, he didn't finish all the pills in the prescription. But that common sense eludes America. And, you know, to get back to the beginning question, are we headed in a good or a positive direction? There's Carl Hart, and there's Maya Solovitz wrote a book about harm reduction, an important book. There's Rhode Island giving passing the framework for drug consumption sites. Boy, will that, if in America we argue about abortion for 50 or 100 years, and there's still people, you know, we don't get into it again, but it stuns me. Christine Whitman is a favored Democratic progressive voice. She's a Republican, and she puts down Donald Trump's anti-Scientism and Democrats. She's always on Joe Scarborough. They love her. She single-handedly prevented the implementation of clean needle exchanges in New Jersey for 12 years at the estimated cost of 750 deaths, minority deaths a year. 650. So that totals over 7,500. Nobody cares. And nobody goes back. That was in the early 1990s. Nobody says, Christine Whitman, didn't you prevent people from getting clean needles, which is now general public health service? Everybody knows that's the right thing. But I bet if they brought that up in Joe Scarborough now, she'd start arguing with that. She'd start saying, well, you can't tell people it's okay to take drugs and expect them not to be addicted, which gets back to my model of addiction. At some point, my model of addiction, our model of addiction is going to have to be adopted, which sort of nobody kind of even recognizes our model of addiction, which is drugs. Carl, of course, says drugs are not the problem. That Australian person says, ask about the person, not the drug. But you need an underlying model of addiction. People get addicted, people die, people don't stop doing things that are hurting them. And that model of addiction has to not be drug-based. It has to be based in human experience and people's interpretation of that and how they seek and need that experience.
You know, I've called you the most honest intellectual I know. I stand by that, and we're trying to disentangle this web of, all right, I'm going to say a bullshit that we hear frequently, and there's some kind of fatigue associated with that when you're a person trying to do that. And I see some people, they'll concede points that they know aren't true just so that they keep the conversation alive. And I'll admit it, I've been one of those people sometimes. I need to just let the conversation continue so I won't attack a point, or I'll let it go. And I think I have to promise everybody that we're going to end this on an upswing. But you had a profound quote from Albert Camus from his book, The Plague, that I don't know if that was a note in our document that was just for me, but I'd love it.
I'm doing a new book, God willing, called To Tell the Truth. And by the way, I got this quote from one of the people whose son I know, who he used to do documentaries for PBS, Bill Moyers, and he did one of the first. I met Maya Solovitz for the first time because she was on the expert consultant producer list. She called me in, and it was a straight disease model in another program, which happened to be about one French village. We sort of refused to go along with the Nazi occupation. They didn't turn over any Jews. They just said, well, and they're sort of sitting there thinking, well, are they going to really kill all of us? And even for the Nazis, that was too much. So the beginning of that 1 hour PBS special was a quote from Albert Camus, The Plague, which is popular again. But again and again, there comes a time in history when the man who dares to say that 2 and 2 makes 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is well aware of this. And the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. this sentence almost makes me cry. The question is one of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. So I can't say whether he's still a touchstone in modern thinking. And so, I touched with him. So you did say we're going to talk about something. The Life Process program has an approach to life and therapy and coaching. And so the New York Times, the New York Times is a stunning publication. So they've decided that to get subscribers, they have to offer like wellness tips. And some of the wellness tips, they're beyond the National Enquirer. You know what I mean? They're not, sometimes they have big research columns. So they had how to be happy. I said, okay, I'll read it. Happiness isn't something that just happens to you. Take these small steps to create a happier life. The number one tip for being happy involves 2 sentences and 2.5 lines. Or so I hope listeners, if they waited this long through all of our waiting through all this mishigas, now they're going to learn how to be happy. Happiness often comes from within. Possibly a lot of people's mothers told them that. And here's the trick. Learn how to tame negative thoughts and approach every day with optimism. Does that remind you of any currents in current psychology, that sentence?
Any currents like positive psychology, like Marty Seligman, all of your research at the University of Pennsylvania?
And optimism is
cognitive behavioral therapy, RAB.
And what's on the opposite side of that? They're saying, they're sort of saying, learn how to tame that.
I see.
It's almost like negative.
They're without being besmirching of it. That's sort of anti-trauma theory.
So this is the New York Times is a well-known publication. It was the most, I think, popular column at one point. How to be happy. Happiness often comes from within. Learn how to tame negative thoughts and approach every day with optimism. And the major movements in America in therapy, I mean, Martin Seligman is big, and optimism and therapy, but it pales in comparison to the massive influx of bestsellers on trauma theory, changing your brain, being in a radical. I mean, they could have had a 100-page essay here. Mm-hmm. Learn how to tame negative thoughts. You can't tame it. Frontal lobe, limbic system. How are you going to tame negative thoughts? So here's how they, down below, that was the number one thing for being happy: conquer negative thinking. And this is written on, who knows? I don't know. All humans have a tendency to be a bit more like Eeyore than Tigger. Do you know all that? Mm-hmm. To ruminate more on bad experiences than positive ones. I wouldn't say all people have it, but it occurs to everybody, and some people dwell in it. Okay, now they're going to get sociobiological, evolutionary psychology. They can't help it. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Overlearning from the dangerous or hurtful situations we encounter through life, bullying, trauma, betrayal helps us to avoid them in the future and react quickly in a crisis.
I think that's a fair pulling from evolutionary psychology. I think that's fair.
And it's actually quite profound. It says if you've had a trauma or been bullied in your childhood, I mean, trauma theory says you're doomed.
Right.
They're saying this, whoever, Martin Seligman didn't write this, nor,
There's a reason you remember those things so that you can spin it differently next time some similar situation occurs.
Oh, no, I recognize that. That's
right.
Somebody trying to roll over on me. Oh, I realize that's something I did that I'll give a shout out to my sister-in-law. Alice, the widow of my brother. She was a Mormon, and she grew up in one of the main Mormon households in Utah. You may be aware Mormons aren't allowed to drink. She went out and got drunk one night, and she threw up on the lawn, and she said, well, I never have drunk that way again. But before she goes to bed, she always has a glass of wine or two. It's, a highlight of her life. When a lot of people learn more or less that way, gosh, that was bad. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm still quoting, but that means you have to work a little harder to train your brain to conquer negative thoughts. Here's how. Solving life's problem. Challenge your negative thoughts. Socratic questioning is a process of challenging and changing irrational thoughts. People accuse me of using the Socratic method. Studies show that this method can reduce depressive symptoms. The goal is to get you from a negative mindset, I'm a failure, to a more positive one. I've had a lot of success in my career. This is just one setback that doesn't reflect on me. I can learn from it and be better. This is pretty profound. And here are some examples of questions you can ask yourself to challenge negative thinking. First, write down your negative thoughts, such as I have problems at work and I'm questioning my abilities. Then ask yourselves, what is the evidence for this thought? Can I be misinterpreting the situation? How might I view this situation if it happened to someone else? The bottom line, negative thinking happens to all of us, but we recognize it and challenge that thinking. Now, in the Life Process program, we have we do that. We say we recognize your bad thoughts, we recognize your bad experiences. It'd be crazy not to. But, let's switch up going forward. And one of the techniques we do for that is to have them write a biography. And when people end up in coaching for the purpose of addiction services, they're often kind of preoccupied with negative things in their life and what's happening to them currently. That's where their head is at. And we let them express that. Then the second thing we do is we say, well, what that's recommending, is there any way you can look back on your life? Can you emphasize the positives now? I mean, some bad things have happened. They've happened to everybody. What about the good things? Did you have a good family life? Did you have a good marriage? Did you have a good relationship with your parents? Do you treat your children well? Do you have good job skills? Are there certain qualities you have that you are proud of, that you've utilized in your life? Have you helped people? We go through, it's sort of, why don't you we talk to them about that. And then we say, why don't you rewrite your biography, your memoir, or your CV, and make it about that. Sometimes when you're applying for a job, you want to emphasize the positive. And then in the final phase of that, we say, well, describe your life going forward. Reframe what you're going to be doing in life. We're not after, oh my God, my trauma has affected my frontal lobes permanently. Right. I'm doomed to be a compulsive shopper, to have lousy relationships, to be an alcoholic, to be alcohol dependent. That's not where we're headed. So I just want to say, there's a welter of information that comes in the world. And here in How to Be Happy in the New York Times, they lay out some fundamental truths that actually tie into some of the basic dynamics we're witnessing in society today.
They laid out an LPP ad in this section of the New York Times.
Right. Or they could have said, well, there's one great program that does exactly what we're saying.
Right.
Life Process program, as practiced by, head coach Zach Rhodes. So anyhow, if people were watching this and they said, oh my God, Zach and Peel are going to get into that what's the matter with America today thing, we wanted to be able to advertise this as saying, we're going to teach you how to be happy in 15 minutes. Common sense and the best research and what we practice at LPP all say the same thing.
Brilliant. That's a good note to end on.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks as always, Nathan.